Stay in your lane, Grace. Victoria Sterling snapped her fingers like summoning a dog, then turned her back on the black woman standing 3 feet away. The crystal champagne flute in Victoria's manicured hand caught the morning light as she raised it to her lips, deliberately ignoring Grace Williams completely. "Dr. Peterson?" Victoria spoke into her phone, her voice dripping with concerned concern. "Emma's condition is hopeless. The help keeps trying to interfere, but we both know some children simply can't be fixed." 8-year-old Emma Sterling sat motionless on the marble floor, arranging toy trains in perfect parallel lines. She hadn't spoken in 3 years. Every specialist in Manhattan had failed. Grace stood perfectly still, her dark eyes holding 20 years of classroom victories that Victoria would never see. Her weathered hands carried secrets that $50,000 therapy sessions couldn't buy. The invisible war between them was about to become very, very visible. Have you ever watched someone get dismissed as just the help, only to discover they held the key to a miracle no expert could unlock? 6 months earlier, Grace Williams had walked through these polished doors carrying everything she owned in a single black suitcase. The pink slip from Roosevelt Elementary still burned 20 years of transforming lives reduced to budget restructuring. The Sterling penthouse occupied Manhattan's most exclusive address. Victoria Sterling had inherited her pharmaceutical empire without effort. With absolute certainty, it made her superior to everyone breathing the same air. Her divorce from tech billionaire David Sterling had shattered records. 18 months of courtroom warfare, leaked recordings, lawyers billing more than Grace's former teaching salary. The real casualty sat silent through every screaming match. Emma had been a chattering 4-year-old who arranged toys in mathematical patterns. Then the lawyers arrived. The little girl who once explained quantum physics through building blocks simply stopped. First her questions disappeared, then her laughter, finally her voice. Victoria's solution was an army of specialists. Dr. Marcus Harrison commanded $500 per session. Behavioral therapists arrived with extinction protocols. Speech pathologists approached her muteness as a mechanical problem requiring rewards and repetition. Monthly bills exceeded $50,000. Results were invisible. Grace ate meals in a converted storage space. Victoria's rules were crystal clear. Acknowledge visitors with silent nods, never initiate conversation. Absolutely never overstep boundaries with Emma. When Manhattan's elite gathered for charity meetings, Grace became furniture essential but invisible. The building's other domestic workers shared war stories during elevator encounters. Mrs. Lane whispered about employers who'd forgotten her name after 5 years. Roberto described being blamed for everything from broken appliances to their teenager's drug arrest. But Grace carried a different weight. Hidden beneath pressed uniforms lay a Columbia University teaching certificate and a photograph she couldn't look at most days. Marcus Williams, age 7, his arms around her neck, his smile radiant with absolute trust. The same smile that had faded behind institutional walls while Grace served overseas. Marcus had been 8 when he died, Emma's current age. The cruel irony wasn't lost on Grace. Victoria was paying minimum wage for her to dust furniture around a child who desperately needed exactly the expertise Grace had spent 2 decades developing. Emma's patterns were obvious to Grace's trained eye. Those aligned toy trains weren't compulsive behavior. They were sophisticated organizational thinking. Her repetitive hand movements weren't meaningless stimming. They were complex internal dialogues that regulated her overwhelmed sensory system. The meltdowns that sent Dr. Harrison reaching for prescription pads were Emma's desperate attempts to communicate in a language no adult had bothered to learn. Grace had once been fluent in that language. She'd spoken it with 23 students across 2 decades, including one beautiful boy whose memory lived in the lullabies she hummed through thin walls. Victoria's custody hearing loomed 30 days away. David hadn't visited since Christmas, a stilted video call where Emma stared through the screen while he grew frustrated with her silence. Neither parent had asked Emma what she wanted, but Grace had been listening to every word Emma never spoke. The sound began as a low vibration from the building's bones. By the time Grace reached the living room, Emma's humming had escalated into something primal, a wordless song of desperation. Dr. Harrison stood frozen beside his overturned briefcase, $500 worth of psychology training useless against an 8-year-old's complete meltdown. Emma sat in the Persian rug's center, her small fists beating against her temples in rhythm that made Grace's breath catch with recognition. This wasn't a tantrum. This was drowning. "She just exploded," Dr. Harrison stammered. "I was introducing new behavioral charts, and the vase 30 years of practice, and I've never—" The $10,000 baccarat crystal lay scattered like deadly diamonds. But Grace wasn't looking at shattered luxury. She was reading Emma's hands, watching the desperate message her fingers spelled repeatedly, H-E-L-E-M-E. Victoria materialized in the doorway. "This is your fault, Grace. You've been encouraging this behavior. You're fired." But Grace didn't move toward the door. Instead, she stepped around Dr. Harrison, avoiding crystal shards, and slowly lowered herself exactly 3 feet from Emma, close enough to help, far enough to respect her defensive space. Grace began to hum. Not clinical, measured tones Dr. Harrison used, but something deeper. A melody that had once soothed another little boy through nights when the world felt too sharp and loud. Emma's fists stopped mid-strike. Her keening softened to whispered humming, matching Grace's tune note for note. "What are you doing?" Victoria's voice held genuine confusion. Grace's hands moved in slow, deliberate patterns, not random gestures, but precise sign language. Emma's dark eyes locked onto those movements like a drowning person spotting shore. The humming stopped. Emma's breathing evened. For the first time in 3 years, she looked directly into an adult's eyes without fear. Dr. Harrison's clipboard hit the floor. "In 30 years, I've never seen—" "What did you just do?" Grace didn't answer him. She was listening to Emma's silence, reading the story written in her stillness. This little girl hadn't lost her ability to communicate. She'd simply been waiting for someone who spoke her language. Emma's hand moved slowly toward Grace's outstretched palm. The moment their skin touched, something shifted, a door opening after years of being locked. Emma's fingers moved against Grace's palm in deliberate pressure patterns. S-C-A-R-E-D. Grace nodded once. Then Emma spelled something else, more urgent. D-A-D-D. That night, Grace sat on her narrow bed holding a photograph with edges worn soft from years of handling. Marcus Williams smiled back, 7 years old, gap-toothed, arms wrapped around her neck with absolute trust. The photo had traveled through military barracks in Afghanistan, through Columbia classrooms, through 20 schools where she'd learned some children just needed someone to believe in their hidden brilliance. It had been in her pocket the day social workers said Marcus was better off in institutional care while she served overseas. Marcus had died at 8, alone, in a facility that treated his autism like a problem to contain rather than a mind to understand. Grace pressed the photograph against her chest. She would not abandon another child to a system that saw brokenness where brilliance lived. The decision crystallized like ice forming on glass, sharp, clear, irreversible. Grace opened her laptop and began typing observations she'd collected for 6 months, patterns every expensive specialist had missed. Emma's random behaviors were sophisticated communication attempts. Her meltdowns followed precise triggers, not sensory overload but emotional frustration at being misunderstood. The toy arrangements weren't compulsive. They were mathematical expressions of internal order that calmed her brilliant racing mind. Most importantly, Emma had been trying to ask for her father through every gesture, every carefully arranged pattern, every desperate moment of apparent chaos. The next morning, Grace knocked on Victoria's bedroom door at exactly 7:15. Victoria answered in silk pajamas, her face mask still drying. Grace? What are you— I want 1 week, Grace said, her voice carrying 20 years of classroom authority. 7 days to work with Emma using proper methods. If I fail, I'll leave with no severance, no reference, no complaints. Victoria's laugh was sharp as broken glass. You think you can succeed where Harvard-trained psychiatrists have failed? I think Emma deserves someone who sees her intelligence instead of her limitations. Grace held Victoria's gaze steadily. And I think you're more afraid of me succeeding than failing. The accusation hung between them like a challenge thrown down at dawn. Victoria's mask cracked slightly. Fine. 1 week. 1. But when you fail, and you will, you leave immediately. No dramatic exits, no contact with Emma, no spreading stories about this family. Crystal clear. Grace turned to leave, then paused. 1 condition. No cameras, no Dr. Harrison, no interference. Emma and I need space to build trust. Victoria's smile was predatory. Fine. Fail in private. It'll be easier to clean up the mess. Behind her door, Victoria was already planning Grace's humiliation. But in the living room, Emma sat with her toy trains, arranging them in a new pattern, not parallel lines this time, but a perfect circle. A circle that looked exactly like a countdown clock. Day 1 began at sunrise. Grace entered the living room to find Emma already awake, sitting cross-legged beside her train collection, moving each piece with surgical precision. Instead of redirecting this behavior like every specialist before her, Grace sat down and began moving her own invisible trains in the same rhythm. Emma's hands stopped. She looked up, studying Grace's movements with scientific intensity. For 30 seconds, they sat in parallel motion, 2 minds finding the same frequency. Then Emma smiled. The first genuine smile anyone had seen in 3 years. Grace pulled out a notebook and began sketching Emma's train patterns, transforming them into mathematical equations. Not to analyze or correct them, but to understand the language Emma was already speaking fluently. Each arrangement told a story, parallel lines for calm days, circles for confusion, zigzag patterns for chaos she felt when adults talked about her like she wasn't there. You're doing math, Grace whispered, showing Emma the equations. Beautiful, complex math. Emma's eyes widened. She pointed to the notebook, then to herself, then back. The question was clear. You see me? I see you completely, Grace said. Day 2 brought the first real breakthrough. Emma led Grace to her bedroom closet, pushing aside expensive clothes Victoria never let her choose, revealing hidden drawings. Hundreds of them. Detailed sketches showing everything Emma understood, her parents fighting, therapists talking in circles, lawyers dividing her life into pieces. One drawing stopped Grace's breath. Emma had captured every detail of custody hearings she'd supposedly been too young to understand. The judge's gavel, her father's empty chair, Victoria's crocodile tears. At the bottom, in careful 8-year-old handwriting, nobody asked me. They should have asked you, Grace said. What would you have told them? Emma picked up a purple crayon and wrote across a fresh page, I want Daddy to come home. Day 3 shattered every assumption about Emma's capabilities. Grace brought a tablet loaded with communication software, expecting to spend weeks teaching basic symbols. Instead, Emma's fingers flew across the screen like a pianist playing a familiar song. Within an hour, she was constructing complex sentences, sharing thoughts trapped inside her brilliant mind for years. Her first complete message appeared in bold letters. The doctors think I'm broken. Am I broken? Grace's military training had taught her to stay composed under fire, but this question nearly destroyed her professional facade. She typed back carefully. You're not broken. You're speaking a different language, and most adults forgot how to listen. Emma typed furiously. You understand my language? I'm learning it. Will you teach me more? Yes, but Mommy doesn't want me to be smart. She wants me to be sick. The truth hit Grace like a physical blow. Emma understood everything. The inheritance implications, the custody arrangements, the way Victoria's identity as a martyred mother depended on having a damaged daughter to manage. Day 4 brought the moment that would haunt Grace's dreams. Emma approached carrying an old iPhone, her father's contact glowing on screen. Her tablet message was simple. "Can I call Daddy?" Grace's heart raced. This wasn't a therapy protocol. This was a daughter wanting her father. What would you say to him? Emma typed, "I would say, I miss him. I would say, I'm not broken. I would say, come home." Grace looked at the phone, then at Emma's hopeful face. Victoria had forbidden contact with David, claiming it would destabilize Emma's progress. But Emma's progress was happening precisely because someone finally saw her as a whole person capable of making choices. "Let's practice first," Grace suggested. "Show me what you want to tell him." Emma spent an hour crafting the perfect message. "Daddy, this is Emma. I'm using a computer to talk now. I love you. Please come see me. I have so much to tell you." Day 5 brought Dr. Harrison appearing at the door, claiming Victoria asked him to check on Emma's regression. Grace met him in the foyer, blocking his path to the living room where Emma was working on an autism awareness presentation, her own autism awareness. "I need to see my patient," Dr. Harrison insisted. "Emma isn't your patient today. She's a student, and this is her classroom." Emma appeared beside Grace, tablet in hand. She showed Dr. Harrison her screen. "I don't want therapy today. I want to learn with Grace." Dr. Harrison's jaw dropped. In 18 months of sessions, Emma had never directly communicated with him once. How did you... He looked between Grace and Emma, his professional certainty crumbling. "What methods are you using?" Emma typed a new message. "Grace doesn't try to fix me. She tries to understand me. There's a difference." Day 6 brought Victoria's first real panic. She'd been watching through security cameras, witnessing transformations that threatened everything she'd built her identity around. Emma laughed. Emma communicating. Emma displayed intelligence that made Victoria's hopelessly disabled daughter narrative impossible to maintain. Day 7 arrived like dawn after the longest night. Emma had prepared something special, a presentation she called My Real Story. Using her tablet and artwork, she'd created devastating clarity. Slide after slide showing Emma's inner world, her love of patterns and numbers, her frustration with being misunderstood, her desperate desire to connect with her father. Her final slide contained a single sentence that would change everything. "I'm ready to talk to Daddy now." Grace looked at Emma's hopeful face, then at the phone number she'd memorized. Victoria was out at her charity meeting. This was Emma's moment. "Are you sure?" Grace asked. Emma nodded, then typed, "With you here, I'm brave enough." Grace dialed David Sterling's number, putting the call on speaker. The phone rang once, twice. "Hello?" David's voice filled the room deeper than Emma remembered, tired in a way that spoke of 3 years carrying guilt. Emma looked at Grace, who nodded encouragingly. Then Emma leaned toward the phone and did something that would echo through the Sterling family forever. She spoke her first word in 3 years. "Daddy?" The silence stretched across the phone line like a held breath. David Sterling's voice, when it finally came, was broken with 3 years of suppressed emotion. "Emma? Baby, is that really you?" But before Emma could respond, the penthouse door slammed open with hurricane force. Victoria stood in the entrance, her face twisted with rage bordering on hysteria. Behind her loomed David Sterling himself, his expression thunderous. "Get away from my daughter." David's voice carried boardroom authority. "Right now." Emma's face crumpled. The phone clattered to the floor as she scrambled backward, seeking safety in her train corner. The first words she'd spoken in 3 years died in her throat, replaced by familiar humming that signaled complete retreat. "I told you she was manipulating Emma," Victoria said, voice dripping vindicated triumph. "Playing psychological games for money. People like her always have an angle." Grace stood slowly, military training keeping her voice level despite fury rising in her chest. "Emma chose to call you. She's been preparing for weeks." "Preparing?" David's laugh was harsh. "You think you can program my daughter like one of your cleaning routines? She hasn't spoken in 3 years and suddenly you wave some magic wand? She spoke because someone finally listened. She spoke because you filled her head with false hope." Victoria moved protectively toward Emma, who was now rocking violently in her corner. "Look at her now." "Look what your interference has done." Dr. Harrison appeared in the doorway, having arrived with David and Victoria. His face held a satisfied expression of someone whose predictions were being proven correct. "This is exactly what I warned would happen." Unqualified intervention leads to psychological regression. Emma's humming grew louder, more desperate. She was retreating into herself, her brief emergence into connection disappearing like smoke. Grace watched in horror as 3 years of walls rebuilt themselves in real time. "Emma, sweetheart," Grace said softly, stepping toward the corner. "Don't." David's voice cracked like a whip. "Don't you dare manipulate her further. Security is on their way up. You're done here." Grace's heart shattered as she watched Emma curl into a tighter ball, her tablet forgotten, her drawings scattered. The breakthrough that had taken a week to build was crumbling in minutes. But then something extraordinary happened. Emma stopped humming. She lifted her head, looking directly at her father for the first time since he'd entered. Her dark eyes held clarity that made all 3 adults freeze. Slowly, deliberately, Emma stood up. She walked past her scattered toys, past Dr. Harrison with his clipboard, past Victoria's outstretched arms. She positioned herself directly between Grace and her father. 8 years old, barely reaching David's waist, Emma spread her arms wide like a human shield protecting the woman who had seen her completely. "Emma, come here," Victoria commanded. "Come away from her." Emma shook her head once. Clear. Definitive. The first direct refusal she'd given any adult in 3 years. "Baby, please," David said, his voice softer now, confused by his daughter's protective stance. "I'm trying to help you." Emma looked up at him, and for a moment Grace thought she might speak again. Her mouth opened, her breath caught, the words hovering just behind her lips like birds preparing to fly. But the moment shattered. The weight of 3 adults' expectations, the noise of their adult complications, the impossibility of explaining everything she'd learned about herself crashed down on her at once. Emma's mouth closed. She stepped back, pressing against Grace's legs, but her eyes never left her father's face. The message was wordless but unmistakable. She had chosen her side. David was staring at his daughter, really looking at her for the first time since he'd arrived. In her eyes, he could see something that stopped his breath. Recognition. Intelligence. Communication that had nothing to do with words and everything to do with choice. His daughter was protecting someone who mattered to her. Someone who had reached her in ways that all his money and all Victoria's specialists had failed to achieve. "You called me," he said softly, speaking directly to Emma. "On the phone. You said Daddy." Emma nodded once. "Why now?" After all this time, why now? Emma released Grace's hand and walked to her scattered tablet. With trembling fingers, she typed a message and held it up for David to see. "Grace taught me I'm not broken. Now I'm brave enough to love you again." What happened next would be talked about in family court circles for years. Emma walked to her bedroom with the purposeful stride of someone who had been planning this moment longer than anyone realized. She returned carrying something that made Dr. Harrison's clipboard slip from his nerveless fingers. It was her old iPad, the one Victoria had declared too advanced for a special needs child. The screen was cracked from when Victoria had thrown it during one of their custody arguments, but it still worked. And Emma had been using it in secret for months. She handed the device to her father, her small fingers swiping to a folder labeled The Truth. David's face went pale as dozens of video files appeared, each dated and titled with 8-year-old precision. The first video began to play. Emma's face filled the screen, younger looking than she appeared now, her eyes bright with intelligence that Victoria had spent 3 years denying existed. "Hi, future Emma," the recorded voice said clearly. "This is day 1 with Grace. I decided to record everything so nobody can lie about what really happened." David's hands shook as video after video revealed the truth. Emma documents her own progress. Emma explained her autism in ways Harvard-trained psychiatrists had never understood. Emma describes her feelings about the custody battle with clarity that made Dr. Harrison's professional assessments look like childish guesses. But the most devastating recordings were the ones Emma had captured accidentally or perhaps intentionally. Victoria's phone conversations about keeping Emma manageable for custody hearings. Dr. Harrison admitted to colleagues that Emma was probably more aware than his reports indicated. Most damning. Victoria instructing household staff to hide Emma's drawings and communication attempts from David during his supervised visits. "She's been awake this whole time," David whispered, his voice breaking. "All those visits when I thought she didn't recognize me." Emma typed rapidly. "I recognized you every time. Mommy said you didn't want to see me talk because it would make you sad." Victoria stepped forward, desperation replacing her earlier confidence. "She's confused." The recordings are taken out of context. "I understand everything," Emma said aloud, her voice clear and strong. The first complete sentence she'd spoken in 3 years rang through the penthouse like a bell. Dr. Harrison actually dropped his clipboard. In 18 months of therapy sessions, Emma had never spoken directly to any of them. "I understand that Mommy needs me to be sick so people feel sorry for her," Emma continued. "I understand that you stayed away because you thought I was broken. I understand that Grace is the first grown-up who thought I was worth listening to." David reached for his daughter with trembling hands. Would you let me hug you?" Emma nodded, stepping into his arms for the first time in 3 years. As David held his daughter, tears streaming down his face, he whispered words Victoria never wanted him to discover. "You're perfect exactly as you are." The real war was about to begin. Victoria Sterling had built her empire on reading market conditions and striking when competitors showed weakness. Watching her ex-husband embrace their supposedly hopeless daughter who was suddenly speaking in complete sentences, she recognized the exact moment her carefully constructed narrative began to collapse. But Victoria hadn't become a pharmaceutical heiress by accepting defeat gracefully. "David, we need to talk, privately." Her voice carried steel that had intimidated boardrooms across 3 continents. "Emma, go to your room. The grown-ups need to discuss your situation." "No." Emma's voice was clear and firm. "I want to hear what you're going to say about me." Victoria's mask slipped, revealing something cold underneath. "This is exactly what I mean. She's been coached to be defiant. Grace has been filling her head with ideas about autonomy completely inappropriate for a child with her limitations." Dr. Harrison, unusually quiet since Emma's revelation, suddenly found his voice. "I have to agree. This sudden communication breakthrough, while remarkable, could be intensive behavioral conditioning rather than genuine progress." Grace felt the familiar chill of being dismissed by people who'd never tried to understand what they judged. Emma's communication isn't conditioning. It's authentic expression that's been suppressed. by untrained domestic staff practicing psychology without a license, Victoria interrupted, her voice rising. David, she's been experimenting on our daughter, using techniques she learned from internet articles and YouTube videos. David looked between his ex-wife and Grace, confusion clouding his face. The certainty he'd felt moments before began to waver. Grace, what exactly is your background? Do you have formal training in autism therapy? The question hung like a trap. Grace felt Emma's eyes on her, trust and fear warring in that 8-year-old gaze. I was a special education teacher for 20 years, Grace said quietly. I have a master's degree from Columbia University in developmental disabilities. I've worked with hundreds of children with autism. Had, Victoria corrected sharply. You had those credentials before you were fired for incompetence and forced to take a job as domestic help. I did my research, Grace. Budget cuts don't usually target competent teachers. The lie hit Grace like a physical blow. She'd never been fired for incompetence. The budget cuts had been real, devastating, completely beyond her control. But Victoria had twisted the truth just enough to plant doubt. Dr. Harrison sensed blood in the water. I'm legally obligated to report suspected child endangerment. Unlicensed therapeutic intervention can cause severe psychological damage to vulnerable children. Emma stepped closer to Grace, her newly found voice trembling with confusion. Grace didn't hurt me. She helped me. Sweetie, you don't understand, Victoria said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone she used with donors who asked too many questions. Grace made you think you were better, but she was just playing games with your emotions. That's very dangerous for someone with your condition. David pulled out his phone, his fingers moving with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making quick decisions based on incomplete information. I'm calling our family attorney. If there's any chance Emma has been subjected to unauthorized treatment, you're calling a lawyer? Grace's voice carried 20 years of classroom authority, but underneath, David could hear something breaking. Your daughter spoke for the first time in 3 years, showed you evidence of her intelligence, and your response is to call a lawyer. I'm protecting my daughter from someone who may have manipulated her vulnerable mental state, David replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Emma's tablet fell to the floor with a crack that echoed through the penthouse. She stared at her father, watching her hero transform back into just another adult who saw her as a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be heard. I wasn't manipulated, Emma said, her voice small but determined. I was loved. Victoria moved swiftly, pressing her advantage. David, I've already contacted the authorities. Child Protective Services is sending someone to evaluate the situation. And I've spoken with our custody mediator about Grace's influence on Emma's psychological state. Grace felt walls closing in with military precision. Victoria had outflanked her, completely turning Grace's greatest strength into apparent weakness, twisting Emma's breakthrough into evidence of exploitation. The sound of the elevator arriving sent ice through Grace's veins. When doors opened, 2 police officers stepped out, followed by a stern-faced woman carrying CPS identification. We're here about a report of child endangerment, the lead officer said, his eyes settling on Grace. Ma'am, we need you to step away from the child. Emma's face went white. She grabbed Grace's hand with both of hers, holding on like someone drowning. No! Grace didn't do anything wrong. But the adults weren't listening to Emma anymore. Dr. Harrison was explaining behavioral regression patterns to the CPS worker. Victoria was describing unqualified interventions to police officers. David was demanding full psychological evaluations to determine if his daughter had been harmed. And Grace was being handcuffed in front of an 8-year-old girl who had finally learned to trust an adult, only to watch that adult being taken away like a criminal. Emma, listen to me, Grace said as officers led her toward the elevator. None of this is your fault. You are brilliant and beautiful and perfect exactly as you are. Don't let them convince you otherwise. Emma's scream followed Grace into the elevator raw, wordless, the sound of a child's heart breaking in real time. As doors closed, Grace caught one last glimpse of Emma collapsing to the floor, returning to rocking motion and desperate humming that had defined her life before their week together. Victoria's plan had worked flawlessly. In 30 minutes, she had destroyed a week's worth of progress and eliminated the one person who posed a threat to her carefully constructed narrative. But Victoria had underestimated exactly how much Emma had been learning, recording, and planning during those 7 transformative days. Emma Sterling was far from finished telling her story. Grace Williams sat in a holding cell that smelled of industrial disinfectant and broken dreams. 36 hours since Emma's scream echoed through the penthouse. 36 hours since watching a little girl's breakthrough crumble under adult fears and legal maneuvering. Dr. Marcus Harrison arrived Tuesday morning carrying a thick manila folder. His face held none of the professional superiority that had defined their encounters. "I owe you an apology," he said, setting the folder down. "And possibly my career. I've reviewed all security footage from the Sterling penthouse. Victoria gave me access, thinking it would support her case." Harrison opened the folder, revealing screenshots. She was wrong. The images told an undeniable story. Emma engaged, communicating, learning. Grace responded with expertise that transformed isolation into connection. Most damning, timestamps showing Emma's breakthroughs happened when Victoria was absent. "In 30 years, I've never seen therapeutic progress this dramatic or authentic. What you accomplished in 1 week, it's unprecedented." "Then why am I in jail while Emma's locked in silence?" Harrison flushed with shame. "Because Victoria Sterling pays my practice more than most clients pay in decades. I let financial incentive cloud my judgment." He slid a document across the table. "My formal assessment recommending you be reinstated as Emma's primary support. I'm also recommending Victoria's custody be reevaluated for deliberate interference with treatment." "Why now?" Emma changed everything. She stopped eating, sleeping, and responding to anyone. Yesterday, David fired me and demanded all files be reviewed by independent specialists. Harrison leaned forward. "That psychologist spent 3 hours reviewing Emma's case. Her preliminary report states Victoria has been systematically sabotaging Emma's development to maintain control of inheritance assets tied to disability status." Meanwhile, David Sterling was having his own crisis. For 3 days, he'd watched Emma retreat into deeper silence than anything during the divorce. She wouldn't eat, wouldn't look at him, and spent hours staring where Grace used to sit. David's phone buzzed. "Mr. Sterling, this is Sarah Lane from Roosevelt Elementary. I taught with Grace Williams for 15 years. I have information about her qualifications that contradicts what you've been told." They met in Queens, far from Manhattan gossip. Sarah arrived carrying testimonials, teaching awards, documentation painting a radically different picture of Grace Williams. "Grace was never fired for incompetence," Sarah said, spreading documents across their table. "She was our most successful autism specialist. When budget cuts eliminated special education, she refused to transfer because she wouldn't abandon her students." She handed David a letter signed by 37 parents. These families offered to fund Grace's salary independently. She declined because it was unfair to children whose parents couldn't afford private support. David read testimonial after testimonial describing miracles exactly like what he'd witnessed with Emma. "There's something else," Sarah said quietly. "Grace's son, Marcus. He was autistic, brilliant. Grace was deployed overseas when social services institutionalized him despite her legal challenges." Her voice broke. "He died in state care while Grace fought to get home." She blamed herself for choosing military service over staying to fight the system. David felt something crack in his chest. She lost her own autistic child and saw Emma as a second chance to save a child everyone else had given up on. By Thursday, The coalition supporting Grace had grown beyond expectations. Former students posted videos describing how Grace changed their lives. Had justice. For Grace trended as the autism community rallied around a teacher who proved disabled children were capable of extraordinary things. Dr. Elena Rodriguez from Mount Sinai released a statement supporting Grace's methods. Parent advocacy groups called for investigations into family courts prioritizing wealth over children's needs. Most powerfully, Emma had found a way to advocate from her silence. Using her tablet, she'd been uploading videos to a YouTube channel documenting her journey with Grace, complete with commentary about being finally understood. The video that broke the internet was simple. Emma looking directly into the camera, speaking clearly. "My name is Emma Sterling. I am autistic. I am not broken. Grace Williams taught me differences make me special, not sick." Adults who punish people for helping children need fixing. Within 48 hours, 3 million views and comments from autistic advocates worldwide sharing stories of being misunderstood, mistreated, and saved by teachers like Grace. Victoria's phone rang constantly with reporters. The pharmaceutical heiress who built her image on charitable generosity suddenly faced questions about criminalizing the only person who successfully helped her daughter. The most devastating blow came from David's legal team. While preparing for custody hearings, they discovered financial irregularities in Emma's trust fund. Victoria had been diverting money meant for Emma's care into personal accounts, justified by inflated medical bills and unnecessary interventions. The money trail revealed Victoria's financial incentive to keep Emma disabled, dependent, and isolated. The trust provided significantly more money for a severely autistic child requiring lifelong care than a high-functioning child who might live independently. Grace had unknowingly threatened a multi-million-dollar fraud by helping a little girl find her voice. The battle for Emma's future was becoming a war for society's treatment of vulnerable children. Grace Williams was no longer fighting alone. Manhattan Family Court had never seen anything like it. By 8 a.m., 300 people lined sidewalks carrying signs reading, "Let Emma speak," and "Grace Williams is a hero." News vans crowded the street. Number sign Justice. For Grace had exploded overnight, reaching 15 million interactions. Inside courtroom 4B, Judge Patricia Morrison surveyed a scene challenging every assumption about routine custody hearings. The gallery packed beyond capacity with advocates, reporters, families whose children had been in Grace's classes. Victoria Sterling entered, flanked by 3 attorneys whose combined rates exceeded most annual salaries. She wore perfect grieving mother attire, navy suit, minimal makeup, practiced vulnerability. Her performance had worked in previous hearings. Today, the audience wasn't buying it. Grace walked in wearing a simple gray dress, dignity intact despite 5 days' detention. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent 20 years advocating for children who couldn't advocate for themselves. When she sat down, the entire gallery rose in silent support, a standing ovation louder than words. Victoria's lead attorney, Marcus Webb, stood with polished arrogance. "Your Honor, we're here because a vulnerable autistic child was exploited by unqualified domestic workers using amateur psychology to manipulate an 8-year-old's emotions. Emma Sterling suffers severe autism requiring professional medical management, not fantasy interventions from someone playing therapist without training." Webb clicked to his first slide. Emma during pre-Grace meltdowns, crying and rocking. This is Emma Sterling's reality. Severe, debilitating, requiring constant professional intervention. Ms. Williams exploited temporary behavioral modifications to convince this child she was cured dangerous delusion, causing severe psychological regression. He presented Dr. Harrison's original reports, painting Grace as opportunist exploiting Emma's vulnerabilities. The argument was polished, professional, completely devastated by what happened next. David Sterling stood in the gallery. "Your Honor, I request permission to present evidence contradicting everything Mr. Webb claimed. Judge Morrison looked surprised. Mr. Sterling, you're not represented today? I fired my attorneys yesterday when they advised me to support Victoria's version. I've spent this week discovering everything I believed about my daughter was a lie. Webb objected furiously, but Judge Morrison was intrigued. Highly irregular, but given circumstances, I'll allow it. David approached, carrying Emma's iPad and thick document folder. Your Honor, I'd like to present Emma's own testimony videos she recorded documenting her experiences with Grace Williams, plus evidence Victoria. Sterling has been systematically defrauding Emma's trust fund by maintaining false medical narratives. The courtroom erupted. Victoria's face went white as David connected Emma's iPad to the projection system. Emma's voice filled the room with crystal clarity. Hi, this is Emma Sterling. I am 8 years old, I am autistic, and I am not broken. I made these videos to show people what it's really like when someone treats you like you're smart instead of sick. For 20 minutes, the court watched Emma's documentary of her week with Grace. Not Victoria's manipulated narrative, but Emma's own words describing breakthroughs, joy at being understood, frustration with adults who saw limitations instead of differences. Most devastating, Emma's reaction to overhearing Victoria's insurance call. Mommy told them I'll never get better because if I get better, we get less money. She doesn't want me to be happy because happiness means less money. Webb desperately objected, claiming videos inadmissible, but Judge Morrison was transfixed. Mr. Webb, your client described Emma as nonverbal and intellectually disabled. How do you explain this communication level and self-awareness? Before Webb could answer, courtroom doors opened. Grace's heart stopped as a small figure walked down the center aisle, carrying an iPad, wearing the determined expression of someone who'd made an impossible decision. Emma Sterling had come to testify for herself. Emma! Victoria started rising, but Judge Morrison's sharp look kept her seated. Emma approached the bench with the confidence of someone who'd finally learned her voice mattered. She handed the iPad to the court clerk, who connected it to projection. Your Honor, Emma said, 8-year-old voice clear and strong. I made a presentation about what I want to happen to my family. May I show it? Judge Morrison leaned forward. Emma, do you understand what's happening today? Yes. You're deciding who I live with and whether Grace gets in trouble for helping me be myself. What would you like to tell the court? Emma clicked the first slide. Why Grace Didn't Hurt Me, a presentation by Emma Sterling. 20 slides systematically dismantled every argument Victoria's attorneys made. Emma presented intelligence evidence, progress documentation, most damaging of all, recordings of Victoria coaching her to act more disabled during custody evaluations. The final slide was simple. I want to live with my daddy, and I want Grace to be my teacher. Not because they made me say this, but because they let me choose this. Emma looked directly at Judge Morrison. Grace taught me different doesn't mean broken. Victoria taught me being myself makes people sad. I don't want to be sad anymore. The courtroom was utterly silent. Victoria's mask completely slipped, revealing desperation and fury. She doesn't understand what she's saying, Victoria said, voice rising with hysteria. She's 8 years old. She's severely autistic. You can't take a disabled child's word over medical professionals. Emma turned to face her mother directly. I understand everything, Mommy. I understand you need me sick so people give you money and attention. I understand you're scared of me being smart because smart kids ask questions about where money goes. Judge Morrison had heard enough. Mr. Webb, I'm ordering an immediate forensic audit of Emma Sterling's trust fund. I'm also ordering a comprehensive evaluation of Emma's cognitive abilities by independent autism specialists. She turned to Emma. Young lady, you've shown remarkable courage coming here today. This court will protect your right to be heard and be safe." Emma nodded solemnly, then walked to Grace and took her hand. "Can Grace come home with us now?" Judge Morrison looked at the packed courtroom, evidence that shattered every assumption, an 8-year-old girl who'd just taught adults about justice. "Ms. Williams, all charges dismissed. Mr. Sterling, temporary custody awarded pending trust fund investigation. And Emma, you get to choose who helps with your education." Emma's response echoed through the courtroom and into streets where hundreds streamed proceedings live. "I choose Grace. I chose my daddy. And I choose to keep being exactly who I am." 6 months later, Grace Williams stood before a congressional subcommittee on autism education reform, Emma Sterling beside her translating for nonverbal advocates. The same hands that had once cleaned Victoria's marble floors now held testimony that would reshape how America approached neurodiversity in schools. "Honorable members," Grace began, "Emma Sterling is not here as a success story to be celebrated. She's here as proof that our education system fails children not because they're broken, but because we refuse to learn their languages." Emma leaned toward the microphone, her confidence stark contrast to the silent, rocking child Grace had first met. "I want to tell you what it feels like when adults see problems instead of possibilities," she said clearly. "And what happens when someone finally sees you as whole." The legal aftermath had been swift and merciless. Victoria's pharmaceutical empire crumbled under federal investigation revealing years of trust fund fraud. The money stolen from Emma's care had funded Victoria's lavish lifestyle while her daughter suffered in manufactured silence. Victoria faced 20 years in federal prison, her charitable foundation dissolved, her reputation destroyed. Dr. Harrison's practice imploded when families discovered his willingness to maintain false diagnoses for financial gain. His medical license was suspended pending investigation into dozens of cases where he'd prioritized profit over children's well-being. But real transformation happened in a penthouse that had once echoed with Victoria's demands and Emma's silence. David Sterling had converted the 42nd floor into something unprecedented, a neurodiversity learning center where Emma worked alongside other autistic children, teaching them that differences were strengths to celebrate, not deficits to hide. Grace found herself at the center of a movement she'd never intended to start. Parent advocacy groups begged her to consult on cases where children were being misdiagnosed, mismedicated, misunderstood. Autism specialists who'd spent careers trying to make children normal suddenly wanted to learn Grace's methods. David Sterling had undergone his own metamorphosis. The tech billionaire who'd once measured success in market share now measured it in his daughter's laughter, her questions, her fierce advocacy for other autistic children. He'd established the Emma Sterling Foundation, funding neurodiversity education research. "I spent 3 years believing my daughter was lost to me," David testified before the congressional committee. "I was wrong. She was never lost. I just didn't know how to find her. Grace Williams didn't cure Emma's autism, she cured my ignorance." Emma's YouTube channel had grown to millions of subscribers who followed her daily life, her insights into autism, and her fierce defense of other neurodivergent children. "Some grown-ups think autism is a puzzle to solve," Emma said in her most popular video, filmed in the learning center that had once been Victoria's sterile penthouse. "But we're not puzzles. We're just people who think in different colors. Grace taught me that my colors are beautiful." Grace's journey had led her far from the storage room where she'd once slept among cleaning supplies. She now directed the Sterling Foundation's educational initiatives, traveling to schools where teachers learned that behavior was communication, that stimming was self-regulation, that children they'd labeled difficult were often the most gifted. But the moment that would define Grace's legacy happened on a Tuesday morning in October, in a small classroom in Queens where she'd returned to do what she'd always done best, teach. A new student sat in the corner, arms wrapped around his knees, rocking slightly. His name was Marcus. A coincidence that made Grace's breath catch. He was 8 years old, nonverbal, and recently diagnosed with autism. His parents had been told he'd never speak, never connect, never be normal. Grace had heard those predictions before. She sat on the floor 3 feet away from Marcus, pulled out a notebook, and began sketching patterns that matched his gentle rocking motion. After 10 minutes, Marcus looked up. Their eyes met, and Grace saw intelligence waiting patiently for someone to notice it was there. "Hello, Marcus," Grace said softly. "I think you and I are going to understand each other very well." 3 weeks later, Marcus took Grace's hand and led her to a computer, where he typed his first words, "You see me." Grace's response was immediate. "I see you completely." The Sterling penthouse had been transformed from monument to wealth into beacon of hope. Where Victoria's crystal had once reflected artificial light, children's artwork now covered every wall. Where silence had once reigned, the sound of learning, talking, laughing, typing, signing filled every room. On Grace's nightstand, 2 photographs sat side by side. One showed Marcus Williams, her son, his arms around her neck, his smile bright with trust. The other showed Emma Sterling at her congressional testimony, standing confidently at the microphone, her voice carrying power to change minds and hearts. Grace had learned to see these photos not as before and after, but as always, love continuing, hope persisting, children's potential recognized and celebrated regardless of how their minds worked. The little girl who couldn't speak had found her voice. The teacher who'd lost everything had found her purpose. And together, they'd proven that profound transformations happen not when we try to fix what's different, but when we learn to celebrate what makes each mind beautifully, brilliantly unique. 1 year after that first broken crystal vase shattered on marble floors, Emma Sterling stood at her father's kitchen counter preparing breakfast, not because anyone told her to, but because she loved the mathematical precision of measuring ingredients. Grace entered carrying lesson plans for the neurodiversity program that now operated in 12 states. She wore the same quiet dignity that had once survived Victoria's cruelty, but now it carried the weight of vindication, purpose, transformation, rippling outward. "Good morning, Emma," Grace said, accepting the perfectly symmetrical plate Emma offered. "Good morning, Grace," Emma replied, then added their daily ritual. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for teaching me to look." David appeared in the doorway, his phone buzzing with notifications from the Emma Sterling Foundation's latest initiative funding autism advocacy programs in underserved communities. The man who'd once measured success in stock prices now tracked progress in children's voices finally being heard. On the kitchen table, Emma's latest YouTube video was still trending. "Being different isn't something you fix," she said to her millions of followers. "It's something you celebrate. And when someone tries to make you smaller so they can feel bigger, remember that your differences are your superpowers." The video had 17 million views and counting. But the real miracle happened every morning in this kitchen, where a little girl who'd been dismissed as hopeless now planned advocacy campaigns, designed educational curricula, and reminded adults that the most profound wisdom often comes from voices society tries hardest to silence. Emma looked up from her breakfast. Her dark eyes holding the confidence of someone who'd learned her worth wasn't determined by how closely she resembled everyone else. Some stories end with dramatic transformations, but the best ones end with daily choices. Choosing to listen instead of assume, to celebrate instead of fix, to see brilliance where others see limitations. Emma Sterling's flame would illuminate paths for children around the world who'd been told they were broken, proving that sometimes the person everyone overlooks holds the key everyone's been searching for. Final questions. If you saw someone being dismissed as just the help, would you look closer at what they might truly offer? What talents might you be overlooking in people society has taught you to ignore? Sharp-eyed viewers will catch the moment at 8:47 when Emma shows she's been planning her courtroom testimony for weeks. The clues were there all along, hidden in her train arrangements that spelled out justice in mathematical sequences. This story proves that connection transcends credentials, that the most profound healing happens when we stop trying to fix what's different and start celebrating what makes each mind beautifully unique. If Grace's journey moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that every person carries hidden gifts worth discovering. And if you believe in second chances, in looking beyond surface judgments, in the power of one person's love to change everything, subscribe for more stories of unlikely heroes, changing lives one connection at a time.
The story you heard today wasn't cleaned up. It was told exactly as it happened. At Black Voices Uncut, we believe that's the only way truth can live. If you felt something, hit like, comment, and your reaction, and subscribe. Every week, we bring you voices that refuse to be silenced.